So now Honors U.S. History is going to begin a look at Thomas Jefferson's administration all the way through the first half of the 19th century, looking at the impact of the Industrial Revolution, the development of a market economy, and transportation and communications. And this will include a look at the War of 1812. This unit includes both Chapter 7 and Chapter 8. And first, we will begin our look with the overview of the Jefferson administration. Now, Thomas Jefferson, although he's a planter and a slaveholder, he tried to appeal to, or at least to consider, the plight of the so-called common man. After all, he is the one that had included the phrase, "all men are created equal," in the Declaration of Independence. He had a vision for the nation where the nation itself would spread out over the continent, with the people enjoying the bountiful produce of the land and sending its products, both those grown as well as those manufactured, across the seas in trade with all nations. For the most part, he envisioned America as being a nation of farmers, albeit with a small and thriving merchant class. Since this was not what the Federalist Party had envisioned for the United States, conflict between the parties would inevitably result. One area where you had this conflict between the parties, it was particularly visible, was in the battle over the judiciary. The case that resulted in the first instance of the Supreme Court using its right of judicial review began with the last-minute appointments that John Adams made to the federal bench in the wake of his loss to Jefferson in the presidential election of 1800. Remember that elections are held on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, but the inauguration of the new president wasn't going to take place until March 4th of the following year. That's basically 4 full months. In addition, not only did the Federalist Party lose that presidential election, they had also lost control of both the House and the Senate as well. The only branch of government that they could continue to control was the judicial branch, and as judges are appointed for life, that influence could last for a very long time. Because of this, the Federalists, in those 4 remaining months, quickly expanded the number of judge positions that were available and filled them with members of the Federalist Party. John Marshall, who even today holds the record for the longest-serving Chief Justice in American history, was one of those last-minute judicial appointments, securing ultimately for the Federalist Party both power and influence that lasted well beyond the existence of the party itself. Well, in addition to Marshall, William Marbury was one of those last-minute appointments, not often nicknamed as midnight judges, and appointed to a federal judgeship. But since there were so many being appointed and so much at the last minute, not all of the letters of commission were delivered before Adams was officially out of office. When Jefferson was sworn in and appointed James Madison to be his Secretary of State, some of those letters were still sitting on Madison's desk. At Jefferson's orders, Madison refused to deliver those letters. And since Marbury was waiting for one, he sued Madison in federal court and tried to get the Supreme Court to issue what was called a writ of mandamus, a court order that would compel Madison to deliver the letter. The issuance of these writs was an action that had been assigned as a power of the Supreme Court, according to the Judiciary Act in 1789 that had set up the lower court system in the first place. John Marshall, the new Chief Justice, who himself was a midnight judge, would ultimately issue the ruling in 1803, and that ruling would have profound effects on the power of the court from then on. Marshall said that although Marbury was entitled to his appointment according to the Judiciary Act, that law that granted the Supreme Court the power to issue such writs, such as the ones that would force the delivery of the commission, that law, or at least that portion of the law, was not constitutional. Therefore, Marbury was not allowed to become a judge. In essence, what the Federalist John Marshall had done was it had sacrificed a small Federalist victory, getting one more judge, for a much larger one, which was the right to review any laws that might be passed by the now Democratic Republican-controlled government, in essence carrying out for the first time their power of judicial review. In terms of a significant foreign policy development, there was one in the Jefferson administration that would actually cause a bit of a dilemma for Jefferson, and that was the Louisiana Purchase. Now, when Jefferson came into office, Louisiana was still officially owned by Spain, as it had been since the end of the French and Indian War. But in 1802 it came to light that Napoleon Bonaparte and the King of Spain had negotiated a transfer of the Louisiana Territory back to French control, a transfer that would actually occur just a few weeks prior to the United States purchasing the land. The implications of this transfer of the Louisiana Territory back to the French was the fear that the right of deposit that had been granted by the Pinckney Treaty could possibly be revoked in the city of New Orleans, which could seriously hamper American trade for settlements in states that were west of the Appalachian Mountains. So early in 1803, President Jefferson sent James Monroe and a delegation to Paris with a plan to negotiate to purchase the city of New Orleans and a bit of surrounding land to ensure that the lower Mississippi River would always be open to American trade. Monroe was authorized to spend up to $10 million, and if he failed in his efforts to purchase New Orleans, he was authorized to travel to Britain to offer to ally with the British, temporarily of course, in their continuing war against France. For Napoleon, though, the war in Europe wasn't progressing quite as easily as he had hoped, and he was also having difficulties with a slave revolt on the French island of Haiti. Therefore, his dreams of the reestablishment of a French North American empire appeared as if they were going to be too costly, especially in light of the wars that he was engaging in across Europe. So before Monroe even arrived in Paris, though knowing he was coming, Napoleon summoned the U.S. minister to France, a man by the name of Robert Livingston, and offered to sell to the U.S. all of the Louisiana Territory for the purchase price of $15 million. Without waiting for permission from Jefferson or even for Monroe to arrive, Livingston quickly accepted before Napoleon could change his mind. The Louisiana Purchase, once concluded, would include all of the territory seen here in yellow, and would more than double the size of the United States by adding more than 600 million acres of land, working out to a cost of approximately 3 cents per acre. But there was a bit of a constitutional dilemma associated with the purchase of this land, because nowhere in the Constitution was the purchase of territory mentioned. So there was a big question as to whether or not this was even legal. And Jefferson, as a member of the Democratic Republican Party, had long been what would be called a strict constructionist, believing in a strict interpretation of the U.S. Constitution, only doing what the Constitution allowed and nothing more, the remaining powers being reserved to the states. However, in Jefferson's mind, this opportunity was simply too good for the nation, and so he supported the purchase of the territory, effectively changing his own principles because he believed that it would promote the peace and security of the nation in general. And interestingly, it was the Federalist Party, who previously had been in favor of doing anything that wasn't prohibited by the Constitution, who actually offered some opposition to the treaty, although it still ended up passing with overwhelming support. Once the land was acquired, and actually even a bit before, Jefferson came to the realization that he really wanted to know what it was that lay to the west of the Mississippi River. And so the conclusion of the purchase of this territory was the perfect opportunity to discover what was in that region. In 1803, he got Congress to fund an expedition into the territory, and he appointed former Army officers Captain Meriwether Lewis and Lieutenant William Clark to lead this expedition, known as the Corps of Discovery, traveling in to the rugged wilderness. It was hoped that Lewis and Clark and their party would follow the Missouri River northward and determine whether or not the river eventually connected to the Pacific Ocean, either directly or via other rivers that it crossed into, in effect discovering whether or not this was a mythical Northwest Passage. It's not. Along the way, Lewis and Clark and the rest of the Corps of Discovery were to investigate the plants and the animals that lived in this Louisiana Purchase territory, especially the northern part that was least known, and to negotiate peaceful relationships with Native Americans who lived there. Jefferson even went so far as to have a special coin, a peace medal, made up to give to the chiefs of any tribes that they met along the way, that was essentially a guarantee of a direct and immediate meeting with the President of the United States should the chiefs of any of these tribes ever want to come to Washington, D.C. to meet the chief of this great new nation, which is how Jefferson was portrayed to the Native Americans, is that he was the chief of a nation. The Corps of Discovery would set out from St. Louis in 1804, which is why today St. Louis is known as the gateway to the West. From there, they would travel along the Missouri River until they reached the Rocky Mountains, where they would trade with the Shoshone tribe for horses so that they could get over the rugged mountainous terrain where their boats would no longer be effective. It turns out the Shoshone, who were particularly mistrusting of strangers, was the perfect tribe for the Corps of Discovery to negotiate with, and they even had a bit of an advantage, as one of the translators they had hired had a young wife who would prove to be particularly useful in the negotiations with the Shoshone because she was Shoshone, and she wasn't just a member of the tribe and therefore could speak the language. It turned out she was the sister of the current chief of the tribe, and as a young child she had been kidnapped many, many years earlier and ended up effectively being sold into a kind of slavery to which her husband, Toussaint, had been able to remove her from. And so she would be valuable in terms of negotiation because basically it was a joyous reunion. And the celebration would benefit Lewis and Clark and the Corps of Discovery when it came to getting the supplies they needed to get across the mountains. In addition, the fact that she was a woman traveling with this party of men clearly meant that this was not a war party. And it wasn't even just that she was a woman, but she was also a woman with a small child. And so the native tribes that they met along the way may not have known entirely what to think about this group, but they knew that this group wasn't necessarily a direct threat because of the presence of Sacagawea. After leaving the Shoshone and continuing through the Rocky Mountains, the Corps of Discovery eventually arrived along the Pacific coast in what is present-day Oregon. They built a fort to protect them over the winter, and after spring arrived, began their journey back towards St. Louis, with the party splitting up for a time as they covered more ground through the northern Rockies. Eventually, they got back to St. Louis in 1806. Now, since science was a significant purpose for this expedition, members of the Corps of Discovery had received some level of instruction in everything from astronomy to botany, climatology, ethnology, geography, meteorology, mineralogy, ornithology, that's the study of birds, and zoology, all of which allowed them to keep detailed records of what it was they had discovered. They described plants and animals. They described both food and medicinal uses for anything that they encountered with the Native Americans. They documented natural resources and plants that had been previously unknown to Euro-Americans, although obviously they were not unknown to the indigenous peoples. And during the expedition, they described more than 200 new plant and animal species that had never before been seen by those in the East, and made contact with more than 70 Native American tribes. The Lewis and Clark expedition would gain an understanding of geography in the Northwest and would produce the first accurate maps of the area. During the journey, they produced more than 140 maps. They would be the first Americans to cross the Continental Divide, the first to see Yellowstone, what will eventually become Yellowstone National Park, in the upper corner of what is today Wyoming and southern Montana. After the expedition concluded, the maps that were produced would be distributed far and wide and allowed the further discovery and settlement of this vast territory and beyond in the years and decades that followed, even allowing for the settlement of the Pacific Northwest in what came to be known as Oregon country. And some of the original trails that they forged when they went through this wilderness would become the basis for future trails, such as the Oregon Trail, the Mormon Trail, and eventually even the California Trail, bringing people across the Great Plains, across the Rocky Mountains, and to the Pacific coast.